Greetings, everyone. Today you will learn about the greatest triumph of the Great Crusade and the exaltation of the first among equals. The Great Crusade quickly gained momentum after the capture of the solar system. The legions of Astartes, supported by the forces of the Imperial Army, Skitarii cohorts, the Mechanicum Army, and the Titan legions, methodically expanded the boundaries of human dominion. Imperial archivists and historians were always seeking any clues about human-populated planets from the dark age of technology. The fleets of Mechanicum explorators and families of free traders also assisted in this endeavor. At the vanguard of the crusade stood the Emperor personally, with Horus at his right hand. Father and son spent a great deal of time together. Horus absorbed the wisdom and ingenuity of the Emperor and also learned the art of war from him. Over time, the Emperor and Horus grew very close. In battle, they invariably fought shoulder to shoulder, and after the battles, they conversed for many hours. During one battle, Horus lost consciousness from a plasma charge hit, and the Emperor alone defended his son against the onslaught of the enemy until reinforcements arrived. On the planet Goro, Horus had the opportunity to repay the Emperor. During a battle with the Orcs, a massive Orc war boss knocked the Master of Mankind down and began to strangle him. Seeing this, an enraged Horus rushed to his father's aid and tore the Orc chieftain's arm off. The Emperor trusted his son infinitely, and so when another Primarch was found and the Emperor needed to temporarily leave the crusade, it was Horus who was honored to lead the crusade further until the father's return. During this time, the Lunar Wolves Legion earned a great many accolades for their valor. The zeal to be first and best remained with the Legion even after reunification with other Primarchs. The reputation of the Legion always preceded their fleet. Regiments of the Imperial Army and even other legions of Space Marines often requested their participation in joint operations with the Lunar Wolves, all to personally witness the famed Legion in action. As for the relationship with his brother Primarchs, Horus tried to maintain relations with each, becoming a close friend to the majority of them. He was incredibly happy every time his lost brothers were found and tried to get to know them as soon as possible. They, in turn, were drawn to him as the most experienced and closest to the Emperor. Horus also had an incredible ability to utilize all his combat resources and to see the most complete picture of the battlefield. This meant that he always knew precisely how to employ each legions of Astartes, not just his own, but every regiment of the Imperium army as well. The Crusade knew many glorious victories in the name of the Imperium, but its peak of triumph was manifested on the world of Ullanor Prime. In the Ullanor system there were several planets, all of which had been seized by the Orcs under the command of Warboss Uruk. This was one of the largest Orcish empires in the history of the galaxy, and thus posed a significant threat to the advancing fleet of the Great Crusade. By that time, nearly all the Primarchs had been found, so for such a large-scale battle, as many of these legendary demigods as possible were needed. In that battle, besides Horus, Rabut Gilliman and Jagatai Khan also participated with their legions. As a result, the following plan was devised. The Primarchs would attack all the planets in the system except for Ullanor Prime, and as soon as the main forces of the Greenskins rushed to defend the planets, the Emperor and Horus, with the support of the Lunar Wolves and the Imperial Army, would deliver a lightning strike on the capital on the main planet. This was Horus's favourite tactic, striking with the spearhead of his army at the head of the enemy's army, so that after its head was crushed, its body would fall under its own weight. While the Emperor and the main forces, with Titan Legion support, stormed Uruk's palace, Horus, with a circle of elite warriors in Terminator armour known as the Justarin, teleported directly inside the palace. Horus's squad had to hack their way through Orc hordes before they reached the throne room. There, they were met by a whole gang of large Orc knobs, as the best warriors among Orcs are known, and leading them was the war boss of the Orc Empire himself. Merely upon seeing him, Horus charged into the attack, trying to tear the enemy apart with his lightning claws. The Justerin tried to support the Primarch with bolters, but fearing accidentally harming him, also rushed into melee combat. It was a most intense battle, but ultimately Horus managed to impale Urlach with his claws. The Primarch lifted him over his head, carried him to the balcony of the palace, and tossed him towards the defending orcs. Seeing their great boss turned into a piece of meat, the orcs wavered, and the remaining nobs immediately began to divide power and declare themselves the new emperors of Ulanor. Despite the attack of the imperial forces, the orcs began to fight among themselves for power. Watching the ensuing chaos, Horus understood that victory had come at the moment of the boss's killing. Returning to the throne room, the Primarch saw that all the nobs were dead. But from his squad, only one Space Marine remained. He was the leader of the Justerin, the captain of the first company of the Lunar Wolves, Ezekiel Abaddon, who was also the closest friend and advisor to Horus. At the same time, Khan and Gilliman also conducted brilliant campaigns on neighbouring planets, so in the following months, the warriors of the Imperium were only occupied with searching for surviving orcs. For the Imperium, this was the greatest victory of the campaign, a triumph that would go down in legends. Horus had many achievements to his name even before Ulanor, and after, he became the greatest hero of the Imperium, of course, after the father. The Emperor decided to immortalize the significance of this victory. Platoons of the Mechanicus Geoformers were convened on Ulanor Prime. With their machinery, they cleared all orc corpses, laying atop a giant plaza exceeding the size of several cities combined. They constructed a highway with but a single structure, a massive pavilion made of granite and black marble transported from Holy Terror. Along the roadway, poles adorned with the skulls of orc leaders were erected, while torches of considerable size lit the highway in the blue-white flame of Prometheum. And then the greatest parade thundered forth. Troops were summoned from across the Imperium. Endless ranks of Imperial regiments reached the horizon. Behind them rose the legions of Titans, and above them Aeronautica Imperialis solemnly flew by. The battle participants were awarded an onyx golden triumph stripe for their uniforms, signifying endless valor and loyalty. These strips were forged from bolt gun casings gathered on the battlefield. Then came the legions of Astartes. A total of 14 legions and 9 Primarchs participated in the parade. Each son of the Emperor was accompanied by a circle of warriors closest to the Primarchs. Such elite guards were created in the legions, following the example of the Justerin of the Lunar Wolves. After the parade and ceremonial speeches, the Emperor spoke. He once again acknowledged the valor and tactical genius of Horus, but then something happened that no one could have anticipated. In full hearing, the Emperor announced that he was leaving the Great Crusade and returning to Terra to undertake a secret project for the benefit of all mankind. He appointed Horus as his successor, declaring his new title War Master. Now Horus would lead the ships of the Crusade further, and the rest were to serve him as if the Emperor himself spoke through the Primarch. The crowd erupted in ovations, yet Horus's brothers darkened. They were, of course, happy for Horus's recognition of valor, but now he was no longer a brother to them. Previously he was first among equals, but now he had risen above them. What saddened them most was the departure of the Emperor to Terra. It seemed to them that the Father had abandoned them, that they had completed their work, and now they were just unnecessary tools for him. And at that moment, the soft voices of the Chaos Gods echoed in the minds of each of the Primarchs. They sought to turn grievance and perplexity into something far more dire. After the parade, Horus also received a proposition from the Emperor to rename his legion the Sons of Horus, to once more highlight their merits. However, the Primarch declined. True, as time passed, Horus came to understand that he was drifting away from his brothers, losing their respect among them. And in a lengthy conversation with Sanguinius, Horus eventually decided to rename his legion. He changed the heraldry and colours of the armour. Now, on the battlefield, the legionnaires extolled not only the Emperor, but also their Primarch. Who knows, perhaps at that moment Horus did harbour ambitions to attain his father's power and possibly surpass him, a fertile ground of the mind for destructive forces. The Emperor undoubtedly was an extraordinary being, primarily due to his incredible psychic powers. And of course, he knew about the existence of other individuals sensitive to warp energy and with capabilities to utilize it. Some of the psychers were vitally necessary for the Imperium, such as navigators and astropaths. However, as the Great Crusade progressed, unauthorized sorcerers were found more frequently. The psyker gene propagated more quickly among newborns, and this became a problem. The Crusade forces discovered entire planets mostly populated by sorcerers who had been sweetly corrupted by the gods of chaos. Even among the Space Marines, the number of psychers was on the rise, and thus legionnaires with such abilities either were forbidden to use them or faced persecution, and sometimes even worse. Others, such as Magnus the Red, Sanguinius and Jagatai Khan, seeing the potential in such unique warriors, organized librarius in their legions, creating also mind-training programs for more effective use of psi energy in combat and for greater protection against the destructive forces. They even convinced the Emperor to approve such an experiment, and having obtained his consent, they indeed gained a powerfully augmented force for their legions. Magnus and his legion, the Thousand Sons, where everyone was skilled psychers, naturally suffered the most from their brothers' distrust. The main opponents of sorcery from the Emperor's forces even refused to conduct joint combat actions side by side with the Legion of the Crimson King, and Magnus himself was repeatedly openly accused of using dark magic and forbidden rituals. The fiercest opponents were Leman Russ, who saw in sorcerous tricks only danger and dishonor, and Mortarion, who still bore the scars from the giants, the sorcerers of his home planet. At some point the tension in the Imperium reached its peak and even threatened with a schism. The Emperor was concerned about the accusations towards Magnus and the quarrel between the Primarchs, as well as the potential danger that could arise from the librarians. He understood that before he could calmly return to Terra after the Ulanor triumph, this problem needed to be resolved once and for all. Therefore, he ordered the Council of Nicaea, to which all Primarchs were invited, some librarians of their legions, the Lords of Mars, as well as the main advisors of the Emperor. The gathered split into those who defended psychers and those who despised it. The Emperor himself sat high as the judge of the entire process. The main accusers were the Sisters of Silence, a special order consisting of female untouchables. Untouchables were called people whose souls had no reflection in the warp. Even being near them caused unpleasant sensations in ordinary people, and for psychers, and especially the demons of the Immaterium, they caused incredible pain. The Sisters of Silence reminded those gathered of the horrors of sorcery, the great risk of succumbing to chaos, the terrible deeds performed by corrupted sorcerers during the Age of Strife, mutants, and the spawn of the warp that could inadvertently be summoned by psychers. On the defense side, Primarch Magnus took the floor. His main argument was that knowledge itself could not be inherently good or evil. Its use depends solely on the intentions of the person who acquires it. It is also necessary to master this knowledge rather than be led by it. With all the eloquence available to a Primarch, Magnus argued that his entire legion had their powers under full control and that their research into sorcery served the good of the Imperium. Magnus's compelling speech captivated many listeners, and opinions were once again divided. No one could deny the danger that sorcerers posed and the crimes they had already committed, but nor could anyone refute the words of the Crimson King. The tension among those gathered once again escalated. At this moment, 12 librarians from different legions approached the Emperor's throne. Speaking was one of them, a librarian of the White Scars Legion named Targutai Yesugai. He spoke of how a psyker's mind is like the talent or body of an athlete, and it needs to be perfected and trained. A psyker, in and of itself, cannot inherently carry the destructive corruption of chaos. Therefore, with proper control and training, the Imperium could gain many most powerful warriors, including among the Astartes. After all the hearings, the opposing sides even began to reach compromises. However, at that moment, the emperor announced that the Council of Nicaea was convened not only to regulate the matters of psychers, it was also a trial against Magnus the Red. He was to answer for numerous charges of sorcery and spreading of forbidden knowledge within his and other legions through the core of Librarius. There were many witnesses to the use of Magnus and the Thousand Sons sorcery, so it was difficult to deny his guilt. The emperor was very angry with his son, as Magnus was the only one to whom he had confided all the dangers and secrets of the warp, and learning that even after his warnings, Magnus still reached for forbidden knowledge, the emperor was beside himself. Their heated dispute would enter history and be recorded in the Grimoire Hereticus. In the end, the emperor pronounced the verdict. The severity was likely fueled by his anger at Magnus, but the emperor's decision was irrefutable. According to the Edict of Nicaea, the legions of the Astartes were forbidden from using librarians. The Librarius were to be disbanded, and the gifted Astartes were to be transferred to regular squads, with a prohibition on sorcery. Additionally, a new position was introduced into the legions. Chaplain, and the chaplain was to ensure the purity of the legion's thoughts and adherence to imperial truth. The only exceptions for psyker use within the legions were astropaths and navigators. Magnus was also forbidden from using his powers. "If you engage with the warp, Magnus, I will come and destroy you. The name of your legion will be erased from the imperial records forever," thus spoke the emperor. This phrase, by the way, could also hint at the fates of the 2nd and 11th legions. The malice and offence Magnus felt cannot be fully conveyed. His main objective was the pursuit of knowledge for a better future, and sorcery made his legion unique. It was their primary weapon. With bitterness in his heart, he obeyed the father's prohibition. Thus, the Council of Nicaea concluded. But did the sons heed their father's warning, who threatened them with death and anathema for disobedience? Many did, especially the opponents of warp forces. However, Magnus's most fervent opponent of sorcery, Leman Russ, kept psychers in his legion, firmly believing they drew their power not from the immaterium, but from the depths of their homeworld Fenris. Alpharius simply ignored the ban, and Magnus continued to explore the mysteries of the warp, only now even more covertly than before. And in times of need, many other legions did not disdain to allow their librarians to summon their powers once more. Future events would yet show the utter dubiousness of the emperor's prohibition, for bans do not work if one betrays him who imposed these bans. The emperor left his sons after the victory at Olenna and went to Terra. He left Horus as his deputy, who received the title of War Master, but this likely left Horus's soul vulnerable to the dark gods. Each Primarch felt abandoned by the father, but Horus, being the very first found Primarch, felt it more acutely than others. He saw his new title only as a consolation for the fact that the father had abandoned him. Commanding the forces of the Crusade, Horus found less and less meaning in the victories and heroic sacrifices of his soldiers. It seemed to him as if the emperor suddenly did not care at all about his feats. His paranoia also grew, believing his brothers were envious of him, disrespecting him, laughing at his command and orders, twisting them at their whim. Those Primarchs who rivaled each other started to openly conflict, and Horus could not reconcile them as the emperor would have. This struck at the War Master's self-esteem and authority. But the last straw was the creation of the Council of Terra, which attempted to perform the duties of the Emperor as ruler, meaning the Primarchs had to submit to mere mortals. Obsessive thoughts arose in his head that his father was to blame for all the arising difficulties. He left his children in the cold void of space. The father, who seemed to have deliberately placed Horus at the head of the campaign, to watch his failures. Soon Horus ceased attempts to reconcile his brothers. He surrounded himself with those Primarchs who unquestioningly obeyed him, or at least carried out his orders swiftly and accurately. And in order to calm his disappointment and paranoia, Horus tried to focus on conquering the galaxy for mankind. However, the seeds of betrayal had already been sown. All that remained was for them to germinate, and soon the servants of ruinous powers were granted the opportunity to assist in this process. Once, Horus's fleet encountered a Xenos race known as the Interrex. They were a humanoid race, similar to humans, highly advanced in technology, surpassing that of the Imperium. Unlike humans, the Interrex sought to first establish friendship when encountering other races, and one race, the Kinnebrach, even became firmly integrated into their community. This was a very ancient and technologically advanced simian people. Together, the union of these two races inhabited several dozen star systems. The Interrex did not wish for contact with the Imperium. They dedicated their lives to the war against chaos and believed that Horus's fleet could be under the influence of ruinous powers. Therefore, Horus's landing on the world of Zenobia for negotiations was seen as an invasion. The fact was that Zenobia housed a museum of various weapons, and after Horus's landing, a very valuable artifact disappeared. It was a Kinnebrach anatheme sword linked to the chaos god Nurgle. No one would ever find out that the blade was stolen by Erebus, a chaplain of the Word-Bearers Legion, who by that time was already a secret servant of the Dark Gods, as was his Primarch Lorgar, who had devised this plan. Conflict flared between Horus's forces and the Xenos, escalating into warfare. This led to the downfall of the Interrex race. Sometime later, on the feral world of Davin, in the midst of battle with the local insurrectionist humans, Horus was treacherously wounded by an anatheme. The strike was delivered by Yugen Temba, the former governor of the colony on Davin, seduced by chaos and secretly given the blade by Erebus. Following the advice of the same Erebus, the dying Primarch was taken to the local priests of the Serpent Lodge. The plan of the Chaos Gods was unfolding perfectly. A ritual was performed over Horus, during which Erebus entered the mind of the Primarch. He told him about the Immaterium, about the true goals of the Dark Gods, and about the arrogance of the Emperor. He showed Horus visions of the future. The Emperor is worshipped as a god, while the Primarchs, no longer needed, have vanished. But Horus was most horrified by the fact that the Emperor used the powers of the warp to create the Primarchs. All these visions strengthened his hatred for his father. The gods of chaos made Horus an offer. He would deliver the Emperor to them, and the Primarch himself would take his place. But then, suddenly, ignoring the Edict of Nicaea, Magnus broke into Horus's mind. He tried to convince his brother not to believe the deceitful words of the traitor Erebus and to maintain faith in their father's plans. But it was already too late. "Horus, I beg you!" exclaimed Magnus, but his voice was already fading and his form trembled and paled. "You cannot do this, or everything we have fought for will turn to dust. You will not make this dreadful step." "Is it so dreadful?" scoffed Erebus. "It's but a small favour. Hand over the Emperor to the gods of the warp, and you will gain boundless power. I have already mentioned that they are utterly indifferent to the material world, and their offer still stands. The galaxy will be yours, and you shall become the new ruler of humanity." "Enough!" bellowed Horus, and all around fell silent. "I have made my choice." Soon Horus awoke. To the surprise of his legionnaires, the Primarch had undergone a radical change. Enraged by the Dictator Father's goals, who aspired only for divinity, Horus began to gather allies. He turned to the closest of his brethren. The first to side with him were Angron, who harboured resentment towards the father; Mortarion, who compared the father's actions to the monsters of Barbarous, and picking up on Horus's contempt for the Emperor. Then Fulgrim joined, who by that moment had already felt the touch of chaos after finding the Lair blade. This blade belonged to a race of serpent-like beings the Emperor's sons had fought against, and contained within it a powerful demon of Slanesh. Horus only fanned the flames of heresy in his brother's heart. Later, Perturabo, who feuded with Rogel Dawn, Conrad Kurz, who foresaw a dark future, and Alpharius Omegon, whose goals were unknown to anyone, joined Horus. And of course Lorgar, as the first traitor Primarch, followed the warrior. Also joining Horus was the Fabricator General of Mars, along with a large portion of the Mechanicus, which became the Dark Mechanicus, and a significant part of the fleet and divisions of the Imperial Army. For the time being, the heretics did not act openly. They were amassing strength, devising plans, and gathering followers. Only Magnus knew of the looming tragedy. Despite his father's strict prohibition, Magnus once again decided to use sorcery to warn the Emperor of the warrior's betrayal. Performing an incredibly complex ritual, Magnus's soul burst from his body and rushed towards Terra, but almost reaching his goal, Magnus's spirit crashed into a psychic barrier. Eager to convey the crucial message to his father, Magnus broke through the barrier, destroying it and shattering his soul into fragments, nevertheless reaching the Emperor's chambers. A massive red figure, engulfed in flame, appeared in the doorway. It burst into the hall, scattering flames. The being, made of flowing streams of light and stellar matter, radiated a brightness that blinded all around. And at the sight of its numerous eyes, none could rid themselves of the awareness of their own mortality. Such a terrifying vision had never been seen before, and the true heart of this being was so mighty that it beat only in specially created flesh. Only the Emperor recognized the magnificent angel, and recognizing it was greatly saddened. "Magnus," he said. "Father," Magnus responded. Their thoughts met, and in that moment of close contact, the galaxy changed forever. Only then did the Crimson King realize what he had wrought. With his thoughtless action, he had destroyed the protection that the Emperor had been building for many years. Protection that he had erected for his secret project. The Emperor had planned to utilize the Eldar Webway for moving humanity across the galaxy without fear of being devoured by warp entities. But now, demons were beginning to infiltrate the Webway, and one of the web's exits was none other than the throne room on Terra. Magnus himself had opened the doors to chaos right into the heart of the Imperium. The Primarch of the Thousand Suns was in dismay and horror at what he had just done, understanding that retribution was inevitable. This meant that the wolves would be unleashed once again. Meanwhile, the traitor forces were planning a major strike against the loyalist forces, and few atrocities could compare with the massacre at Istvan. Magnus violated the Edict of Nicaea and, using sorcery, attempted to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal. Alas, Magnus did not realize the extent of the havoc his desperate attempt to help his father would cause. Passing through the psychic defenses of the Imperial Palace, Magnus's sorcery destroyed them, unleashing a cascade of disasters across Terra and opening warp storms around it. The Emperor's disappointment and anger knew no bounds. An edict was immediately issued, condemning Magnus the Red for violating the laws established at the Council of Nicaea. By the word and will of the Lord of Mankind, the Emperor of the Imperium of Man, this decree commands the bringing of Magnus, Primarch of the 15th Legion Astartes, to Terra, where he will stand before the Imperial throne, to answer for his actions and the actions of his gene-sons. Thus, Lemon Russ, Primarch of the 6th Legion Astartes, is tasked with delivering his brother, using any means he deems necessary, regardless of legal restrictions, permits, or the need to borrow means from others, even if he has to follow Magnus into the boundless void to the end of days. So it is written, and so it shall be. The edict condemning Magnus and the Thousand Sons. The edict was immediately sent to the Primarch of the Space Wolves as well as to Horus. The Emperor hoped that the warrior might offer wise counsel. It was also commanded to assemble an army that was to arrest Magnus and escort him to Terra, and if necessary, capture him by force. The lead commander of the prosecution forces was appointed to be Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Custodes, one of the Emperor's closest advisors. Given that Terra was the main fortress of the entire Imperium, with nearby Mars serving as the main forge of mankind's war machine, the force was quickly assembled. The army consisted of dozens of Terran auxiliary regiments and Imperial soldiers. It was also accompanied by the Sisters of Silence, the Imperium's most potent weapon against Psychers, and the newly formed Ordo Sinister, a sub-legion of Warlord and Emperor-class Titans. It was unique for wielding the incredibly rare Psi Titans, war machines under the control of eternally suffering Psychers, allowing the main Titan operator to utilize some warp energy abilities. Once everything was ready, the prosecutorial force set off for the planet Prospero, but their advance was slowed by warp storms around Terra. At that time, Upon receiving the summons from the Emperor, Leman Russ was assisting the Imperium's army with another Xenos threat. It is recorded that upon receiving the order from the Emperor, Leman Russ swiftly prepared a decisive attack at the heart of the enemy forces and crushed them. However, afterwards, he and his legion immediately retreated and headed for the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris to prepare for the offensive. It is difficult to say whether such fervour was due to his loyalty to the Emperor, or if the Wolf King was driven by rage and malice towards his brother, whom Leman Russ had never trusted. Upon arriving at his homeland, Leman Russ called all the great companies of his legion that were relatively close to their star system. The Wolf King spent about a month gathering the forces of his legion, and without waiting for the full assembly set out to meet Valdor with 50,000 space marines. Their meeting place was the Beta Garman system. However, due to the warp storms at Terra and the relative proximity of Fenris to this system, the Space Wolves arrived at the meeting place a month and a half earlier than Valdor's forces. There, Leman Russ was greeted by the forces that responded to the call of his legion and a part of the forces of Sons of Horus. The main task of the 16th Legion was to deliver messages to Leman Russ from the War Master. It is unknown what exactly Horus conveyed to his brother, but afterwards Russ intended to not only capture Magnus but also to execute him, even though this was not a directive from the father. For these purposes, Horus allocated 5,000 of his legionaries and 12 Titans to assist Leman Russ. When a month and a half later, the prosecutorial force from Terra arrived at Beta Garman, a tense meeting between Russ and Valdor took place. Both men deeply respected each other, but Valdor was firmly intended to carry out the Emperor's order as precisely as possible, whereas Russ believed that killing the sorcerer traitor would better serve the Imperium. Ultimately, Valdor agreed with Leman Russ, but the disagreements between them continued during the war. It took some more time before the prosecutorial force finally set off for Prospero. During preparation, strategies for uniting such spiritually different forces were developed, and Russ demanded a careful study of the planet and its military fortifications. Advancing towards Magnus's planet, the prosecutorial force captured space stations belonging to the Thousand Suns, though all were found empty. Also, no ships of the Sorcerer Legion were encountered on their path. It turned out that Magnus had long known about the army's approach, but instead of ordering the fortification of his system's borders, or even strengthening the planet's defence, Magnus the Red, on the contrary, dispersed his fleet's forces as far apart from each other as possible. Although he had gathered the bulk of his legion on Prospero, the Thousand Suns were unaware of the impending invasion until the last moment. Magnus had completely cut off any means of communication with the rest of the Imperium, including psychic ones. Yet even without the preparation of defences, Tizca, the capital and the only major city on Prospero, was very well fortified. On one side, there were impassable jungles inhabited by dangerous predators, among which the most bizarre and deadly were the invisible swarms of psychic parasites. On another side, the capital was surrounded by mountains, which were fortified with numerous bunkers and defensive laser installations. On a third side, the city was washed by the sea. And finally, on the fourth side, a 100-metre wall was erected, protected by Geller fields, and the city itself was covered by a psychic shield, its strength comparable to the void shields usually placed on space cruisers. Mechanicum forges on the planet could also provide substantial help in defense. The challenging landscape for landing, disagreements in command, and the accusatory force's unpreparedness for a prolonged siege. Originally, this force was just an honor guard for the arrest and escort of Magnus. All contributed to significant difficulties in the upcoming siege. It remains unclear why Magnus deliberately scattered his fleet across the system and did not warn his legion about the attack. Some believe it was merely an expression of pride. Others talk about an attempt at redemption, while some whisper about the mysterious plans of the dark gods that whispered to Magnus. For Russ and Valdor, it remained a mystery. Within a few hours, the accusatory force had completely seized the orbital space around Prospero, meeting almost no resistance. The destruction and capture of orbital stations caused panic among the planet's population, which was further exacerbated by the subsequent orbital bombardment. However, Rus did not want to simply subject Prospero to exterminatus from orbit. He wanted to give Magnus a chance to explain and try to justify himself. The Emperor's decree and demand for Magnus to surrender were broadcasted to the planet, but from the surface came neither threats of resistance nor pleas for mercy. Nothing at all. Rus was offended by his brother's silence, and despite Valdor's pleas to allow more time for a response, he ordered a mass bombardment. Prospero was set ablaze. An hour after bombarding the planet, all that remained of its surface was ash. Only the capital managed to survive, shielded by a psychic shield. For Valdor and Rus, the true nature of such protection around the capital was revealed only then, meaning Magnus had once again brazenly violated the Edict of Nicaea and betrayed the Emperor's trust. The siege preparations began. Although the capital survived the bomb strikes, the defensive line in the mountains around Tizca was destroyed, and the outskirts of the city were buried under stones. The sea washing the capital's other side had almost completely evaporated, hitting the shoreline with a wave of steam. Also, Tizca lost its allies in the form of the Mechanicum. Their forge had been destroyed, including the deep underground complexes. Leman Russ swore an oath that his warriors would be the first to wage war on this planet, and then requested allied forces to stand in reserve. He himself began preparing his legion for the siege. Descending in drop pods to the coastline of Tizca, the Space Wolves broke the aerial defense of Prospero. The first to set foot on the ground was Leman Russ himself, fulfilling his oath. Emitting an inhuman roar, signaling the command to attack, the Wolf King led his sons into battle. The wolves immediately encountered resistance from Tizca's elite guard. But what could a mere guardsman do against the bestial fury of the Emperor's wildest legion? Surprising to the attackers was the fact that they faced only the regular army. The Thousand Sons Legion and their Primarch had yet to show themselves. At this time, the Prospero army tried to sell their lives dearly, exhibiting acts of heroism in each encounter. However, the air forces were entirely annihilated, and only a few fortified positions of infantry remained, desperately resisting the deadly wave of invaders. Key moments of the siege's first phase included the destruction of the fortress of the Acropolis Magna. Leman Russ's force captured the entire region of Old Tizca and continued its advance. The wolves were unleashed, and now nothing could halt their advance. Any pleas for a ceasefire from the citizens were ignored. Russ also disregarded Valdor's suggestion to finally release the reserves into battle. The Wolf King aimed to draw out Magnus's legion and settle scores personally. As provocation, a huge stone statue of the Crimson King was destroyed. Finally, as the attack moved deeper into the city, bolts of bolter fire and flashes of sorcerous projectiles swept through the ranks of the 6th Legion. The Thousand Sons responded to the Wolf's call. Thanks to their magical talents, Magnus's legion halted the wolves' advance, effectively repelling their attacks and inflicting significant damage. Leman Russ, unwilling to lose the initiative, ordered his forces to hold their positions and finally called in the reserves. The Space Wolves' reserves were ordered to continue moving towards the center of Tizca and, if possible, bypass the enemy forces. Russ hoped he had already engaged the enemy's main forces in battle, but it turned out that the Wolf King had underestimated the situation. By this point, the Thousand Sons had long since abandoned any hope of redemption and were summoning ever more terrifying and destructive spells. Seeing that the wolves' attack was faltering, Constantin Valdor directed his forces to assist. He called in all remaining Imperial forces in orbit, reinforcing the attacking squads and destroying the remaining pockets of resistance in the Wolf Legion's rear. The main target of the attack was the capture of the spires located at the city's heart. The Thousand Sons, no longer bound by any prohibitions, conducted secret rituals and sacrifices to discern the invaders' plans and use the darkest and most forbidden spells. Even the custodians, led by Valdor, were astounded by the incredible force that descended upon the loyalist forces. The entire force of the prosecution army was shaken by how far the sons of Magnus had fallen. Rus and his legion denounced the Thousand Sons as their brothers and swore to erase the city and its inhabitants to dust, sparing no one. Valdor was also determined to the utmost. He gathered under his command all the Sisters of Silence, which became the decisive action, as across all fronts the Thousand Sons successfully stopped the attack of the Loyalists. Even the Wolf King could not advance further. However, thanks to the devastating effect that the Sisters of Silence had on the psyches of the Thousand Sons, Valdor managed to successfully break through the traitors' defense. At that moment, Tizca turned into a real hell. A warp storm began over the planet. Prospero's moon covered the sun. The warp storm gradually descended on the capital, consuming its central part. Everything that found itself on the edge of the warp storm was consumed by it. Yet inside it was still possible to be. It was there that the main forces of Leman Russ and Valdor continued to press on the Legion of the Thousand Sons. Magnus's legion retreated to the central spire, where the Crimson King had been throughout the siege, and the Loyalist forces now had to also fend off the spawns of the Immaterium that appeared in the maelstrom of dark warp energy. Finally, when the forces of the Imperium surrounded the remnants of the Thousand Sons' defenders, the Crimson King himself appeared on the battlefield. The brother Primarchs immediately engaged in combat, and Valdor ordered Russ's legion and his troops to continue the offensive, not interfering with the brothers' duel. Under the influence of warp energy, both the Thousand Sons and the Space Wolves felt the touch of curses that these legions harbored. The curse of the flesh turned Magnus's sorcerers into terrible monsters, and Russ's warriors were enveloped by the curse of the Wulfen, turning them into huge semi-wild werewolves. Therefore, the last battle was even more fierce than the previous conflict in Tizca. Finally, Valdor's forces pushed the Thousand Sons inside the spire itself, which also sheltered the civilian population. Valdor's order was simple. Everything inside the spire must die. At that moment, Russ had the upper hand over his brother, breaking his back over his knee and raising his weapon over his head for the final blow. However, before the blow was struck and Valdor's warriors approached the spire, a flash of incredibly bright light enveloped the central building, around which a magical whirlwind spun. Inhuman laughter was heard. Terrible demons materialized on the battlefield and began to destroy the blinded forces of the Imperium. The space around began to go mad. It seemed as if Magnus's last spell destroyed the very concept of reality. And then the light disappeared, as did the spire, as did the Crimson King. In despair, Magnus gave himself over to the will of Tzeentch, the chaotic god of change, knowledge, and sorcery. The war was over. The Emperor's forces won, paying a very high price for it. Leman Russ had defeated his brother, but he did not keep his vow to kill him. The Empire lost an entire legion of Space Marines, and as it would turn out in the future, also gained itself a formidable enemy. For the first time, the Space Marines shed the blood of their brothers in open confrontation. Leman Russ was deeply depressed by all this, and even solemn congratulations from Horus did not soothe him. What irony, to receive congratulations from one who secretly rejoiced at the successful fulfillment of his plans and the plans of the Dark Gods. The Wolf King has yet to learn about the great slaughter that was planned by the War Master, Istvan III. This planet will become the springboard for Horus's decisive actions and the rest of the heretics, but first it's worth telling about its conquest. Istvan III is located in the Ultima Segmentum, far from Terra and the Central Systems. This world was inhabited by a technologically advanced society that settled here during the times of colonization and the dark age of technology. The residents of Istvan survived the Age of Strife almost unscathed. After reconnaissance conducted by the Empire, it was clear that a planet with such a large population and such development simply had to be brought back under its fold. Unfortunately, diplomatic missions failed. The inhabitants of Istvan were too independent and self-sufficient. Moreover, they preached a local religion which was contrary to the imperial truths. Therefore, to resolve the looming conflict, it was decided to send the Raven Guard Legion, led by their Primarch Corvus Corax. The planet fell in one night, the Raven Guard's pinpoint strike beheaded the government, and the protests were quelled. The reports of the Space Marines mention nothing unusual, except for the mention of many cults among the protesters. Nevertheless, the world of Istvan III rejoined the rest of humanity. The ruined palace was rebuilt according to imperial canons, networks of bunkers and tunnels were organized for the imperial garrison, and the planetary defense system was completely updated, and a spaceport was constructed. As the governing figure, Vardus Praal, a former major of the imperial army and a politician from the Ultima Segmentum, was appointed planetary governor. Believing that all necessary preparations had been made, the crusade moved on, leaving the remote planet to develop on its own. This was the beginning of the end. Over time, communication with Istvan became increasingly difficult. Messages from astropaths had to be passed through third and fourth hands due to the great distance. Messages came more and more infrequently, and the warp storms that appeared around the planet further limited Istvan's communication with the rest of the Empire. From the few messages that got through, it was understood that there were uprisings on the planet, led by a cult known as the Warsinger. 6 years after Istvan's capture, one of the Death Guard cruisers picked up a weak astropathic signal. From it became known about a bloody massacre across the planet. Vardus Praal betrayed the trust of the Empire and descended into heresy, leading the Warsinger cult. Ignoring such dire news from a planet with a population of tens of millions was not an option. And it fell to Horus to once again bring Istvan back to the Imperium. He swore to make Istvan a bloody example of what would happen to traitors to the light of the Emperor. However, few knew that Horus first saw this situation as an opportunity to strike a treacherous blow to the Imperium himself. For the assault on the planet, Horus called those who had already embraced his dark side. The Death Guard, World Eaters and Emperor's Children answered the call, along with elements of Horus's own legion. The Death Guard and World Eaters were personally led by their primarchs. Meanwhile, the War Master ordered the legions of the Dark Angels, Ultramarines and Blood Angels to venture to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, thereby drawing away the most powerful of the loyal legions from himself. The other legions were engaged in their military operations, but in Prospero, brother went against brother. A plan of attack was devised in the shortest possible time by the commanders of the gathered legions. It is important to note that Fulgrim did not reach Istvan in time, so the position of commander of the Emperor's Children was taken by Lord Commander Eidolon, one of the Primarch of the Third Legion's closest Astartes. According to the plan, the Death Guard landed near the capital of Istvan, supported by a large amount of heavy machinery, as well as Imperial army forces and Titans that accompanied the Astartes legions. Meanwhile, the Emperor's Children made a drop assault on the main palace and stormed it. They were covered by the World Eaters, who were to hold back the flow of cultists approaching the palace. Sons of Horus, in turn, would storm the temple areas which had been rebuilt and heavily fortified by the heretics. The sky above Istvan opened up, releasing hundreds of drop pods from the clouds. A steel rain covered the city, heralding its imminent demise. However, the War Master and the other commanders could not have anticipated that the cultists could put up a worthy resistance. The attack proceeded slower and was more difficult than initially planned, all because of the large number of psycho-sorcerers amongst the heretics. These sorcerers possessed unnaturally loud voices, their screams driving mad and even warping the armor and bones of the Astartes. Regular cultists were driven into such a frenzied rage that they charged at the Space Marines en masse with bare hands, blocking streets with their own bodies. But the legions Astartes knew no fear and staunchly held back the onslaught of mad fanatics. At this time, the Emperor's Children carried out a perfect landing in the palace, bypassing all air defense systems. Advancing through the vast halls, the Third Legion finally found the head of the traitors, Governor Vardus Praal. He was clad in strange armor and was armed with a monstrous psychosonic weapon, but was nevertheless slain by the best swordsman of the Emperor's Children, Lucius. Simultaneously, Horus's sons, led by Gaviel Loken, stormed the temple fortress and slaughtered all the war singers. Though they faced difficulties, victory was ultimately achieved. The Astartes rejoiced, having managed to overcome such fierce resistance from a formidable enemy in just a few hours. They were unaware that their joy was premature. Immediately following their victory, communication with the fleet was lost, and the Titans retreated beyond the city's boundaries. From orbit, bombs began to descend, within which lay one of the most dreadful weapons of the Imperium, the Life-Eater virus, which in just a few hours could turn all organic life on a planet into decaying sludge. The entire planet, including its forests, oceans, and of course its population, was annihilated. Then, from aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of Horus, a single shot was fired. The sludge following the viral bombardment emitted copious amounts of highly flammable substance, and it took just one shot for the planet to ignite. In an instant, before the fleet of Horus, it was as if a new sun had ignited, and just as swiftly it extinguished, leaving behind a lifeless boulder where a populated planet had stood mere hours before. Vaporized, rotting oceans transformed into stormy clouds. Gale-force winds of massive sandstorms spread the ash and still smouldering embers of the dead world. Horus had delivered his blow. He challenged the Emperor, sacrificing an entire world along with entire companies of the Master of Mankind's Angels of Death. However, Horus was unaware that even before the bombs fell, the Astartes on the surface of Istvan had been warned of the warrior's betrayal. Before the bombs were dropped, among those who remained in orbit, there was significant dissent against such a horrific decision. Nathaniel Garrow was among the chief dissenters. He gathered those who remained loyal to the Emperor, and together they seized the frigate Eisenstein. On it, Garrow hoped to reach Terra and inform the Emperor of his favoured son's dreadful betrayal. The Eisenstein barely survived the traitor's barrage and an emergency warp jump, but more of that tale another time. At that moment, one of the captains of the Emperor's children, named Saul Tarvitz, could not bear what Horus had planned. He hijacked the transport vessel Thunderhawk and flew to the ground forces. Just minutes before the bombs fell, Tarvitz managed to inform the ground forces of the impending exterminatus of the planet. Along with them, Tarvitz took refuge in numerous bunkers and fortifications that withstood both the viral bombardment and the scorching of the entire surface. As soon as the firestorm died down, Horus sent scouts to the planet's surface. His surprise and fury were boundless when he learned that in the ruins of the capital, about 100,000 loyal Astartes had taken refuge. As soon as communication channels were restored, cries of sorrow and despair, of rage and malice, immediately emanated from the planet. The Space Marines had never before shed so much blood of other Space Marines, and thus they could not even conceive that their brothers would betray them so treacherously. But above all, they were plunged into despair by the betrayal of their own Primarchs. The warrior was already ready to command a second bombardment. He could not leave any more survivors. But before Horus could issue the order, the World Eaters landed on the planet. They had already tasted the betrayal and blood of their brethren, and they thirsted for more. Angron met his loyal sons in one of the capital's charred squares. Without unnecessary words, orders, or explanations, Angron and his legion lunged into an attack against their already half-mad brothers, who had found refuge among the ruins. Such bestial fury had not been seen in the galaxy. Both sides were no longer Astartes. They were wild berserkers who desired only the blood of their enemy. Although with losses, Angron's troops bravely eliminated the survivors, and the World Eaters rushed into the city streets seeking new victims. Due to raging internal fury, their legion became uncontrollable. Hence, Horus was compelled to support Angron's attack. Soon the forces of the traitors landed on Istvan. Horus harboured the hope of terminating the onslaught as swiftly as possible and proceeding to the next phase of the plan. However, the traitors' advance was stretched over several Terran months. Clever ambushes, skillfully fortified positions, a large number of bunkers and redoubts held by forces loyal to the Emperor enabled them to hold off the enemy for a long time and pay dearly for each of their lives. Ceaseless storms and tempests prevented the traitors from freely sending reinforcements and supplies to the needed areas, but after several months of guerrilla warfare, the storms subsided. Horus dispatched all forces to the assault, including the Titans. Eidolon of the Emperor's children had all this time attempted to storm the main palace defended by his legion brother Saul Tarvitz. And throughout this time, Eidolon had failed to breach their defence. Not a single siege weapon could penetrate the palace's strongest walls. But when the titans of the traitors combined into a monstrous salvo of their mighty weapons, the walls could not withstand and began to crumble. The surviving loyalists were finished off by the arriving World Eaters. A real hunt for small partisan squads began throughout the city, but the main forces of the loyalists were in the temple zone under the command of Loken. He and his followers from the sons of Horus scraped off the paint and symbols from their armours, renouncing the legion's name and returning to the old one, to the lunar wolves. They held back the enemies as best they could, but the forces of the traitors began to encircle them tightly. Ezekiel Abaddon, the foremost among the sons of Horus, personally took charge of storming the Siren Hold, the main temple. With both fury and regret he sought out his brothers and killed them. But despite heavy fire from all sides and Abaddon's pursuit, about 100 Space Marines managed to break through and escape beyond the city's territory. Resistance was already futile. The Loyalist forces were defeated. But for every fallen Loyalist Space Marine, there were 2 to 3 betraying Astartes. Around this time, Fulgrim finally arrived at Horus's side, with ominous news for the warrior. Horus certainly wished to track down every escaped Loyalist, but time was running out. He ordered a retreat, bombarding the capital with conventional bombs one last time, levelling it to the ground. Though it was a hard-won victory for the traitor forces, the resolution of the situation on Prospero and the havoc wrought by the word-bearers on Kulth only bolstered Horus's successes. The galaxy would burn, and Horus had just struck the first sparks. Immediately after the massacre in the drop zone on Istvan V, Horus began to implement his plan for the siege of Terra. However, the warlord understood that the Ultramar system, under the leadership of his brother Robut Gilliman, could prove to be the force that would almost immediately choke his uprising. The Empire within the Empire, as Ultramar was also called, needed to be weakened and ideally destroyed. That's why, even before the events in the Istvan system, Horus had tasked Robut Gilliman with assembling troops for a campaign in a sector far from Ultramar. The task of destroying the home of the 13th Legion was assigned to Lorgar and Angron. The former had long harboured a grudge against the 13th Legion for their humiliation on the planet of Monarchia, while the latter was simply mad with bloodlust, making Angron perfectly suited for a mission to sow terror and panic in the Ultramarines' home system. Both the World Eaters and the Word Bearers possessed impressive fleets, and together they formed an unbeatable armada. The beginning of their campaign could still be traced by the planets cleanly slaughtered and ships destroyed in space. The World Eaters, Berserkers, and a special unit of the Word Bearers called the Gal Vorbak Assault Troops, whose souls were possessed by warp demons, methodically exterminated the population of the planets near Ultramar. At first, few saw the sense in such widespread slaughter, but it later turned out to be a rather successful attempt to appease the dark gods. The advancement of the 12th and 17th Legions Armada went unnoticed for a long time due to warp storms engulfing the Imperium. The dying worlds had no way to send distress signals to neighbouring Imperial planets, but the traitors could easily travel through the warp without fear of demon attacks. Soon, the heretics' fleet reached the planet Honorum, a beacon of Imperial civilization on the very edge of the galaxy. Beyond it lay only space known as the Ruin Storm, unexplored territory where warp storms constantly raged. Lorgar intended to use them to his advantage. Gonorum's defense was overwhelmed by the power of the traitors' fleets and a devastating assault on the main fortresses. The battle was so horrific that Honorum could not fully recover even 10,000 years after the attack. Meanwhile, the traitors' fleet was able to freely move beyond known space, passing through the mightiest warp storms without hindrance. This was thanks to Erebus, the chief chaplain of the Word-Bearers, who by that time had renounced worship of the Emperor and become a dark apostle. His prayers to the ruinous powers and the millions of sacrifices earned the favour of Chaos. Thus, almost nothing threatened his fleet during transitions through the warp. Occasionally the fleet emerged from the immaterium to raid the border worlds and passing trade fleets, but it never allowed itself to be distracted from the main goal. Using the knowledge found on the raided ships and within the minds of the pilots, the traitors were able to more precisely devise a strategy for the future attack. Finally arriving at the very heart of Ultramar, the Primarchs decided to disperse their forces throughout the system. Angron and Lorgar, with a small but formidable fragment of the fleet, set off to assault the military centre of Guilliman's empire, the planet Armatura. Zadkiel, captain of the Word-Bearers, headed to the system's capital, the planet Macraga, while Lorgar's chief lieutenants, Cor Ferron and Erebus, made their way to the planet Calth. Additionally, small forces of World Eaters were spread throughout the system, given only one command to kill everything in sight. This sowed additional confusion and terror among the population of Ultramar. Calth was the main dock for the powerful Ultramarines fleet, and thus attacking it head-on would have been suicidal. Here the genius of the Primarch's minds shone through. Not far from Calth was a mobile space station named Campanile. Even before the arrival of the Word-Bearers fleet, it was already empty. The entire crew had been destroyed, whether it was a psyker who had gone mad aboard the station or an attack by chaos demons was unknown. What was known was that a traitorous Primarch was to blame. The station was captured by the arriving Word-Bearers, and it was at this moment that the blade of betrayal was raised above Calth. All because Ultramar was still unaware of the betrayal of Horus and his loyal legions, as well as of the attacks in other parts of the sector due to warp storms. Therefore, the appearance of the Word-Bearers near Calth did not arouse suspicion. A small delegation of traitors even visited one of the Ultramarines' cruisers to exchange courtesies. At this moment, Lorgar's plan began to unfold. With the help of warp sorcery, the 17th Legion covertly set the Campanile in motion. The station accelerated to near-light speeds and was directed straight at the space dock orbiting the planet. Within a few seconds, the dock and hundreds of ships, from light scouts to massive cruisers built even before Rabuta was found by the Emperor, were consumed by a monstrous explosion. The Campanile passed through the ships like a knife through butter, exploding right in orbit of the planet. Those ships that were not hit, due to the impulse after the explosion, instantly lost any connection with the fleet and the planet beneath them. The crew lost their sight, not having time to close the shutters of their ship's windows. The massive Ultramarines cruiser Antradamicus survived the firestorm but lost control and was pulled into the planet's gravitational well, crashing onto its surface. Its mass destroyed part of the capital of Calth and the main communication hub of the Mechanicum. Within mere seconds, the heretics extinguished millions of lives in a single strike. Among the forces loyal to the Imperium, panic ensued. The surviving officers either had no communication with their troops or knew not what to do. Through the few remaining Vox channels echoed only pleas for help and salvation. The skies above the planet blazed, and none could have guessed that this was a treacherous assault by the Legion of Lorgar. Rabut Guilliman arrived in the system to reinforce his forces, finding the planet Calth in just such a state. Surveying the wreckage of ships in this dark hour, Guilliman still hoped that it was all merely a mistake and misunderstanding. Perhaps the Word-Bearers thought the enemy had destroyed the space dock and had fired blindly at the emerging ships. The very thought that the Emperor's creations could raise their swords against their brothers was inconceivable to Guilliman. He attempted to establish contact with the 17th Legion's fleet to clarify the situation. However, no one intended to respond. Instead, the Ultramarines' fleet met with a dense barrage from the Word-Bearers' ships. With each passing minute, the Ultramarines lost their ships, but Rabut ceaselessly tried to communicate with Lorgar. Finally, when the channel became somewhat stable and Rabut appealed to his brother with a request to cease fire, he received only the darkest of curses in reply. Only then did the Primarch of the 13th Legion realize the true nature of the situation orbiting Calth. With a heavy heart, he ordered retaliatory measures up to the destruction of the Word-Bearers' fleet. At this moment his forces were bombarding the defenseless cities of Calth, utterly erasing the major island cities in the south of the planet. The word-bearers were preparing themselves a foothold for an assault on the capital, Numinous. Sometime later, Lorgar re-established contact with the Primarch of the Ultramarines. He informed his brother that this traitorous attack was not a retaliatory action for the humiliation at Monarchia. It was a full-blown insurrection of the warrior against his father. He also told Reboot that 3 of the loyal Primarchs had already met death at the hands of the traitors, and Guilliman would be next. As it would later turn out, Lorgar was mistaken about the death of some of his brother. Nevertheless, after this conversation, the Ultramarines officers saw their Primarch in such ferocious anger for the first time. Guilliman threatened his brother with retribution, but Lorgar merely smirked. Suddenly, a strange, nightmarish creature appeared on the deck. None of the Space Marines had ever seen it before, and before those present could react in any way to it, the creature blew itself up, breaching the command deck seals. The Primarch and some of the Space Marines were ejected into the cold vacuum of space, and the Ultramarines' flagship, the Macrage's Honor, began to fill with unseen monsters, later named Demons of Chaos. The first to guess the true nature of the demons, in the sense that they were not just unusual beings but reflections of human nightmares, was an Ultramarine sergeant named Aeonid Thiel. He was also the first to notice that power weapons are much more effective against demons than conventional ones. Although the unexpected assault by an unknown enemy caused confusion among the 13th Legion, resistance focal points were quickly organized throughout the flagship. After 10 hours of combat, at the moment when it seemed there was no hope for salvation, their Primarch returned to the defenders, having survived 10 hours in space without a helmet. Guilliman stood before his legion, burning with rage. It took the Ultramarines commanders considerable effort to persuade their Primarch to help them unite all defenders instead of merely slaughtering the enemies. With the miraculous return of the Primarch, the Ultramarines found hope for a successful rescue from this carnage and for the restoration of defences on Calth. Meanwhile, on the surface of the planet itself, the word-bearers wreaked havoc. In the first 12 hours, about 100,000 Ultramarines were killed, and the word-bearers controlled all strategically important locations on the planet. At their disposal were not only the Space Marine forces, but also legions of Titans and Knights, as well as hordes of cultists and traitors from the Imperial army. The war seemed lost, but the remaining forces loyal to the Imperium could still resist. With great difficulty, Guilliman's sons tried to sell their lives at as high a price as possible. Small resistance foci gradually merged with each other. In one desperate attack on the traitors' forces, the Ultramarines and the Mechanicum managed to regain control over the planetary defense system, and in 1 second, the wrath of the Emperor's servants descended upon the word-bearers. Finally gaining an advantage on the planet's surface, defense weapons were directed at the word-bearers' fleet. They destroyed ship after ship, including the flagship of Corferon, Infidus Imperator. That's why Corferon decided to retreat. Guilliman, in turn, deciding not to let such a vital target escape, entrusted Marius Gage, Magister of the First Order of the Ultramarines, to take a cruiser in honour of Macragge and pursue them. Guilliman would only find out how this pursuit ended many years later. Meanwhile, communication between the fleet and the Ultramarines' ground forces was restored. Coordinating their actions, the Space Marines finally managed to repel the traitors properly. But then, Reboot Guilliman started receiving alarming news. The word-bearers had fired upon the Calth system's sun, making it unstable. The star was sending radioactive winds to the surface of the already wounded planet. Moreover, requests for help were finally coming from nearly all 500 worlds within the Ultramar realm. For the Primarch, it became clear that Calth was not the heretics' only target. The most terrifying news was the approach of massive warp storms around Calth, and if the Ultramarines did not leave in the next few hours, they might not be able to escape from this system for a long time. The Primarch decided to load the remaining Titan forces, the Mechanicum, and a large portion of his legion onto the fleet. To those who remained, he ordered them to descend into the underground cities and continue purifying the planet from the brothers who had succumbed to chaos. The so-called Underground War, from that moment, would last a full 10 years. Before leaving the orbit of Kulth, Gilliman swore that he would return here and rebuild this world anew. The traitors would receive their deserved punishment, and vengeance would be fulfilled. And many years would pass before the Primarch would get such a chance again. The news of Horus's betrayal and the 4 Space Marine legions on Terra was met with righteous wrath and disbelief. But despite the importance of such news, the Emperor ignored it. By his order, nothing and no one dared to distract him from the most important experiment for humanity in the depths of the Imperial Palace. Therefore, the responsibility for the next actions fell on the shoulders of Primarch Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists and Malkador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terra. Dawn intended to fully avenge Horus and the rest of the brothers who had fallen into heresy and took full command over the loyal forces near Terra. It was impossible to send out a call to gather the rest of the forces as warp storms raged around Terra. They interfered with both travel and communication between astropaths. Malkador speculated that this was the nefarious work of the great warp entities, meaning Horus had not just betrayed his father, but also made a deal with the terrifying gods of the ruinous powers. Breaking the blockade required the power of the Emperor himself. But even for such an important cause, they dared not disturb him. Therefore, a desperate decision was made. To power the Astronomicon, the Imperial warp beacon, several thousand psychers were sacrificed. Only this allowed a breach through the storms, and messages from hundreds of worlds immediately reached Terra. Rebellions, uprisings, attacks by traitors. Never before had the Imperium faced such a threat that could hinder everything achieved by the Great Crusade. Rogel Dawn managed to contact 6 Primarchs whom he considered loyal. He warned them of the treachery of the brothers and ordered the legions to gather all their forces in the Istvan system. Dawn hoped to instantly give battle to the treacherous Primarchs. The Legion of the Imperial Fists itself would remain in the solar system to strengthen the defences of the capital world and deal with the arising uprisings on Mars. Dawn was confident in his plan. 6 mighty Space Marine legions clearly would have overcome the 4 legions that had also suffered in the massacre on Istvan III. In reality, that was indeed the case. Only the balance of power was far from in favour of the Imperium. Soon after Rogel Dawn's order, a Raven Guard ship entered the Istvan system. It was a special reconnaissance ship. It had a minimum crew and minimal life support systems, which helped it remain undetected amidst the void of space. Like a shadow, it flew past the worlds of this star system, trying to find traces of the traitorous legions. Loyal Space Marines beheld the devastation that reigned on the surface of Istvan III. Horrific scars from explosions and orbital bombardment covered the entire world. Smoke from burned buildings and machinery had yet to clear, and it seemed as if one could literally hear the voices of thousands of ghosts that perished here at the hands of their once brothers in an instant. However, the traitors themselves, the sons of Korax, had not yet been spotted. Approaching the planet of Istvan V, they intercepted dozens of encrypted Vox communications, as well as detected energy traces of tens of thousands of Astartes. The traitors hadn't fled. They were amassing an army and regrouping. Among the heretics were also forces of the Imperial Army and the Mechanicum cult, who had also turned from the light of the Emperor. Having obtained conclusive evidence, Dawn only became more resolute in his determination to exact vengeance on the traitors swiftly. He was able to summon the forces of the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, Alpha Legion, and the battle-weary Iron Hands fleet under the leadership of their Primarch. Ferrus Manus was the most inflamed with wrath. His closest brother, Fulgrim, personally led his legion against the Iron Hands fleet, after offering Manus to join the rebellion. Rogel Dawn also dispatched a flotilla of Imperial Fists to Istvan, but it was caught in a warp calm and thus could not arrive at the destination in time. The first to approach the system were the forces of the Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Raven Guard. The first ships of the Salamanders and Raven Guard fleets emerged above the surface of the planet in an instant. The rest of their parts, as well as the Mechanicum, Imperial Army, and the Titan Legion's ships, immediately exited the warp behind them. Ahead of such a horrific force, the Primarch of the Iron Hands flagship cruiser, Ferrum, flew at full speed. A few hours were left until the arrival of the other forces, but Manus did not wish to wait even a second. The legions of traitors anticipated the attack. They had constructed stunning fortifications, yet their anti-aircraft system couldn't even slow down such a massive fleet. The surface of the planet trembled as cluster bombs and torpedoes rained down on the enemy fortifications. The salvo couldn't break the defense, but it did distract the defenders for precious minutes. Following the bombs, a steel rain of drop pods followed. Ferrus Manus was at the spearhead of the very first drop assault. For every downed pod, there were dozens that reached the ground. The tightly coordinated, sharp attack and the words of righteous wrath from the Space Marines meant only one thing. The Emperor's Angels of Death had come to deliver vengeance, and it would be bloody. In less than an hour, the main forces of the Loyalists and the traitor forces had already clashed in a furious battle. Ferrus led his legion up the central flag. The Raven Guard advanced on the right flank, while the warriors of Vulcan on the left. So fierce was the onslaught of the Loyalist Astartes that the defensive line slowly but surely began to break. At that very moment, the Primarch of the World Eaters, Angron, led his berserkers into a counterattack. He split the Iron Hands and the Raven Guard, trapping the latter in a vice. The Salamanders also suffered, as entire clouds of poisonous gas flooded the left flank, signalling the arrival of the Reaper on the battlefield. Mortarion also personally led his legion into the attack. The battle reached a deadlock. Neither side gave up even an inch of their territory. Carnage and death reigned everywhere. At the same time, the main part of the Imperial Army and the artillery regiments were finishing their landing. Alas, they could not join the battle. The passage was blocked by mountains of bodies and the debris of rocks, remnants of the first assault. Suddenly, right in front of them, the traitors' hidden bunkers opened, housing units of the World Eaters and the Death Guard. They treacherously took advantage of the momentary confusion of the Imperial command and inflicted devastating damage on the support forces. 3 hours later, both sides gradually began to retreat. The battle was so horrendous that preliminary estimates indicated that both sides lost about 40% of their forces, and this was just in this very first clash. As the Emperor's loyal warriors retreated, 4 clouds of transport ships appeared in the sky. The much-awaited legions of the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and the Alpha Legion had arrived. They quickly took their places behind the main battlefronts, erecting their defensive fortifications. Corvus Corax suggested to the Primarchs of the Salamanders and the Iron Hands to retreat, thereby making room for the newcomers to maneuver. Vulcan supported his brother, but Ferrus wanted to push forward. He did not just hold his perimeter, he commanded to attack, even without the support of his brothers. Such fury attracted the attention of Fulgrim, once the most beloved brother to Manus. The two demigods clashed in a duel, while their legions, once brothers, mercilessly killed each other. At the same time, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard had already retreated to the legions that had come to their aid. This was the beginning of the end. The Primarchs did not know that each of the arriving legions had long renounced their oaths of loyalty to the Emperor and found themselves new masters. They found out only when hundreds of thousands of gunfire salutes marked the triumph of the traitors. The trap snapped shut. 3 legions, which had suffered massive damage, faced 8 legions of heretics. Hope for victory evaporated instantly. Even just surviving in this carnage was practically impossible. 200,000 loyal Space Marines and countless hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers died. 3 legions were practically annihilated, and the final chord of the heretics' triumph, already worn out and mutated from proximity to chaos, was the death of a demigod son of the Emperor. Ferrus Manus and the pitiful remnants of his legion were in the very center of the storm. Enemies were on all sides, and there were endlessly many of them. In the end, the Primarch was left alone, still fighting in a duel with his brother. They rained blows upon each other that would have easily slain any of the Astartes, yet they were far greater and far more sublime even than the Space Marines. Of those who witnessed even a fragment of that duel and lived to tell the tale, it was said to resemble two titans from the ancient legends of Terra, locked in a fierce battle. Finally, the elusive Fulgrim delivered the final strike to his brother and decapitated him with a chaos-tainted blade. Thus ended the saga of the Gorgon, Primarch of the Iron Hands and the first son of the Emperor, he who gave his life due to the traitor's betrayal. Summarizing the massacre in the Drop Zone, as this event would later be called, it could be considered one of the darkest days for the Imperium. The Loyalist legions were almost entirely wiped out. Terra learned of the betrayal of 4 more legions and their Primarchs. Corvus Corax and Vulcan vanished without a trace and were considered dead. But what was certain was the death of Ferrus Manus. On that day, the Emperor's hope for the dominion of mankind in the cold and empty cosmos died utterly. Even before the traitor legions openly challenged the Emperor and all of humanity, Horus actively sought allies. He understood that without the support of the Mechanicum, capturing Terra would be impossible. So even in the early stages of his revolt, he had negotiations with the Fabricator General of Mars named Kelbahal. Kelbahal was the leader of one of the factions of the Martian Mechanicum, and this faction did not recognize the Emperor as the embodiment of their god, the Omnicia. Kelbahal himself was greatly disappointed and discontent with the Emperor's decrees against the research of warp technologies and artificial intelligence, as well as the fact that the Master had turned Mars from a capital of human scientific development into an ammunition assembly line for his conquest. On Mars, even before the Horus Heresy, there had been minor protests and uprisings for the same reasons. But the agreement between Kelbahal and the War Master dramatically worsened the situation. In exchange for support during the uprising, Horus lavishly gifted the Fabricator General with promises of Mars's independence and freedom of research, as well as providing him with standard template constructs, wonders of engineering thought from the dark age of technology. But the most significant gift from the War Master were the access codes to the vaults of Moravec. This was a super-secret location deep within Mars, where inventions and knowledge of an ancient techno-adept who tried to achieve the perfect fusion of man and machine were stored. This knowledge was so dangerous that even the Emperor himself dared not open the vault, lest the horrors of the Immaterium, which had tainted them, be unleashed. However, Kelbahal coveted them above all else. Besides various ancient and dangerous relics, the Fabricator General found in this vault the Scrap Code, a monstrous warp virus capable of infecting all manner of machines, defiling the machine spirit, and turning it towards chaos. The discovery of the Scrap Code was a pivotal event in the civil war on Mars. Within mere hours, the virus had almost entirely devoured everything within its reach. On a planet fully enveloped in machines and electronics, this was not a difficult feat. Vast archives of the Mechanicum, which held the knowledge and secrets of humanity from its very inception, were lost. Factories either ceased their operations, irrevocably halting without a possibility of revival, or were obliterated due to critical accidents. Scrap code caused overheating in nuclear reactors, provoked explosions and fires, released toxic smoke into the city's sewers, burned out electronics, and ruthlessly, irreversibly destroyed the scientific and technological achievements of humanity. By the next morning, after the demonic virus had gained strength, nearly 1 million people had perished, among them 6,000 astropaths, whom the scrap code deliberately eradicated. Mars was cut off from Terra, and the dying screams of the astropaths could be heard by the Emperor, even from within his subterranean palace laboratories. After that night, a warp storm emerged over Mount Olympus, beneath which the virus's vault was situated. The influence of the Immaterium slowly devoured the minds of many survivors, forcing them to rise in rebellion or commit suicide. However, some forges and factories managed to sever all communication channels in time, and the scrap code could not breach them. The survivors, until the very end, did not realize that this was not a terrible coincidence, but a treacherous attack at the heart of Mars. Yet Kelbohal still needed a pretext for initiating war, and soon he got it. An adept of the Mechanicum named Coriel Zeth, also known as the Mistress of the Magma City, renounced any tenets of the Mechanicum cult, yet remained loyal to the Emperor. At that moment, Kelbohal declared her and her followers heretics and started a war that engulfed all of Mars. Legions of Skitari, technologically enhanced human soldiers, combat machinery, automata, orders of knights, and Titan legions. Both sides of the conflict mobilized all the forces at their disposal. The battles touched every corner of Mars, including the Ring of Iron, those very shipyards that encircled the planet. Magma City, a vast factory on the planet's south, became the main support point for the Loyalists. And it was near there that one of the most devastating battles unfolded. A clash of Titans from Legio Mortis, who betrayed the Emperor, and Titans from Legio Tempestus, who remained loyal. Though the Loyalist forces held up well against the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, their defeat was inevitable. The enemy could simply crush them by sheer quantity. However, when the uprising on Mars ceased to be a secret for Terra, Malkador the Sigillite asked Primarch Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists to send reinforcements to the Red Planet, and at the same time tasked him with recapturing and defending the forges of Mars, or if impossible, to evacuate anything of value from there. For commandeering this operation, Dawn chose Captain Sigismund of the First Company. According to the plan, Sigismund's forces were supposed to break through to the military factories of Mondus Oculum and Mondus Gamma, capture them, secure positions, and, if possible, begin a counterattack. These factories produced weapons and armor for the Astartes legions and were therefore vital. However, the Loyalists were not prepared for the already desecrated by the ruinous forces. The Dark Mechanicus would begin the assembly of demonic machines. Grotesque constructs with demons infused within them tore through the Imperial forces. Each second of holding positions was bought with dozens of lives. Ultimately, Sigismund ordered a retreat. A significant portion of supplies had already been evacuated, but an even larger batch had to be left to the traitors. Coriel Zeth could not believe that even the Astartes were powerless in the fight against the heretics of Kelbohal. Mondus Oculum and Mondus Gamma were destroyed. The priceless technologies and machines of these factories burned in the fire. The northern border of Mars was lost to the Loyalists. The Imperial Fist's ships saved as much of the supplies, knowledge and technology as possible. But they did not continue fighting, returning to Terra to save at least the remnants of Mars's greatness. Meanwhile, near Magma City, the last bastion of the planet's southern part, fierce battles of knights and titans continued. But then Deus Tempestus, the mightiest titan of Legio Tempestus, fell defeated. An entire order of the Knights of Tyrannus was also slaughtered. The traitors could no longer be opposed, and the fate of Magma City was sealed. Yet Coriel Zeth did not plan to surrender the city, its secrets, and its people to the traitors. It was not without reason that it had such a name. It was built inside and around a volcano, with streams of lava flowing through the city's aqueducts, delivered to forges and factories. And at the moment of the traitors' triumph, Coriel Zeth lifted all the protocols restricting the flow and protection against magma. The streets were filled with rivers of lava, fire started from all sides. Aqueducts spewing fountains of lava melted and fell onto the city streets. An hour later, there was no one left alive in Magma City. 3 hours later, the city was submerged under lava, burying with it many of the most valuable technologies, knowledge, and hope. Thus, Coriel Zeth executed the last order from Terra. To save as much technology as possible, the rest was to be destroyed. For the Imperium, Mars was lost, half destroyed and half desecrated by traitors. And only after the main battle of the Horus Heresy would the Red Planet begin to be cleansed of the Chaos Blight. But that is another story. After the events at Istvan III and Istvan V, Horus chose to gather his forces as quickly as possible and begin a devastating attack on the cradle of humanity, Terra. Being a brilliant strategist, the War Master developed a plan that allowed him to draw away from Terra as many legions loyal to the Emperor as possible. Because the Path of Malcador the Sigillite learned of the survivors from Istvan V about the massive forces of the traitors slowly but surely moving towards the capital world, only the Blood Angels managed to timely respond to the call of all loyal forces of Terra. The Space Wolves had just finished the slaughter on Prospero, while the Ultramarines were hindered by the audacious attacks of the Word-bearers on their homeworlds. The Salamanders, Raven Guard and Iron Hands sustained such colossal damage on Istvan that they were simply unable to participate in the defense of Terra. The Dark Angels faced a rebellion within their own legion and thus could not arrive in time. The White Scars were mired in space battles with the Alpha Legion. Additionally, a civil war broke out on Mars between the Mechanicum. Terra was left practically without reinforcements in the face of the archenemy. Although the Blood Angels managed to reach Terra before the siege began, just before these events, the Legion encountered, in open battle, the warp spawn known as Demons for the first time on the planet Cygnus Prime. In this battle, Sanguinius engaged in a terrible duel with Khorne's greatest demon, Kabanda, and nearly lost. At the same time, Sanguinius's mind was subjected to a mental attack by the pernicious forces. They tried to lure the Primarch to the side of chaos, but the angel of the Emperor's will was stronger. The angels ultimately triumphed, but the mighty demon cursed the Legion, awakening their genetic flaw, the Red Thirst. This greatest secret of the Legion remained its heavy burden even 10,000 years later. The Red Thirst turned the Emperor's angels into mad berserkers, thirsting only to kill and feast on the blood of their victims. Since then, every Blood Angel fights every day with the growing hunger inside themselves, and sometimes even such superhumans lack the willpower to resist the thirst. Nonetheless, the Sanguinius Legion, having suffered losses and faced with the curse, arrived at the Imperial Palace and assisted their brothers of the Imperial Fists in preparing for the upcoming battle. When the enemy was already at the gates, Terra's forces consisted of only 2 incomplete legions of Astartes with their Primarchs, several Titan legions, about 2 billion Imperial Army Guardsmen, and the Mechanicum forces that were able to break through to Terra, whereas the traitor forces had gained new allies. The Chaos Gods summoned entire armies of demons to aid Horus. Also, the Great Four bestowed their gifts upon some legions. For instance, under Grandfather Nurgle's initiation, the Death Guard Legion transformed into Plague Marines. Almost living corpses, their swollen bodies harboured inside hundreds of inconceivable diseases, but at the same time, they were insensible to pain and fatigue. The Emperor's children were mired in the gifts of pleasure sent to them by Slanesh. The remnants of 1,000 sons who swore fealty to Tzeentch gained even more destructive abilities in the field of sorcery. And the World-Eater Berserkers gained the attention of Khorne, who gifted them with supernatural fury and strength in battle. The rest of the legions chose the path of serving the undivided chaos, not choosing a particular god. To such a devastating force were also joined the Dark Mechanicum and their allied Titan legions, as well as parts of the Imperial army that followed the War Master. The numerical advantage of the traitors was evident, but Horus understood that protracting the siege was also unwise. At any moment, the loyal legions that had not made it to the battle's beginning might flank the traitors. The traitors' forces needed a month to break through to Terra, facing the heroic resistance of the Imperial fleet. Finally, when Horus's fleet reached the capital and encircled the planet, the first bombardments and the first landings of shock troops began. In parallel to this, a battle took place in the orbit of the Moon, whose defensive systems managed to destroy a whole quarter of the traitors' fleet. However, Terra's satellite was still captured by the heretics, and such a significant loss in forces still left the traitors in the majority. When the circle over Terra almost closed, a fleet of the White Scars Legion suddenly emerged from a warp rift. Their experience in lightning-fast attacks allowed them to reach the defending forces with virtually no losses. The appearance of another loyal legion inspired the defenders of Terra, giving the soldiers some hope. The main defensive line and Horus's main target was, of course, the Imperial Palace, which occupied a third of the entire planet. The traitors' forces quickly captured the two nearest spaceports to the palace and began a large-scale deployment of troops. The Chaos Sorcerers massively summoned demons up to the greatest demons of the Great Four. As a result, the loyal forces had to retreat to the walls of the palace. Before the main attack of the Chaos forces on the palace began, the Primarch of the World Eaters came out to the main gates. Angron always looked and behaved like a furious madman. However, what the defenders of the palace saw plunged them into horror. Angron had completely given in to the madness of rage, accepting the greatest gift that a god of chaos could bestow, demonhood. He became a demon prince of Khorne. Angron transformed into a gigantic red-skinned creature with large wings and a terrifying toothy maw. He offered the defenders of Terra to surrender and embrace the side of the true gods. Then many might have laid down their weapons if not for the appearance of Sanguinius. In his presence, not a single soldier dared doubt their emperor. The angel and the demon, once brethren, stared at each other, communicating mentally. After which Angron stepped back from the gates and ordered his troops to prepare for the attack, as there would be no surrender. The greatest battle of mankind began. Horus's forces tried 3 times to climb the walls of the palace, and each time they were met by the ranks of the Blood Angels under Sanguinius's command. The White Scars, led by Jagatai Khan, also defended on the walls and inner perimeters. Yet the traitors gradually pushed the loyalists back. However, the War Master was dissatisfied with the slow progress of his troops and ordered his loyal titans to start a massive bombardment of the walls, into the breaches of which the forces of the heretics immediately poured. Seeing this, Jaghatai Khan and his legion made a daring attack on one of the captured spaceports, splitting the traitors' forces in half with a single strike and cutting off one of their paths for reinforcements. During this time, the forces of the Blood Angels and the Imperial Fists were fiercely holding back the enemy. Yet they were gradually retreating towards the Eternity Gate, the only passage into the inner complex of the palace. Suddenly, from the crowd of attackers, a mighty demon of Khorne emerged. Kabanda came seeking revenge, and the head of the Angel of Baal. Sanguinius once again accepted this challenge, and the two majestic beings clashed in a terrible duel. Sanguinius nearly suffered defeat, but managed to catch the demon off guard, breaking its spine over his knee and banishing it into the warp for a whole 1,000 years. The forces of the Loyalists finally regrouped at the Eternity Gate, then closed it, sheltering behind the palace's lockable defences. The Siege of Terra lasted for 55 days. The defeat of the Loyalists was apparent, with Horus preparing to teleport to the surface to personally lead the final assault. However, news of the imminent arrival of the Dark Angels and Space Wolves forces reached him, followed by the Ultramarines. Horus was anxious, as the reinforcement of the Loyalists could greatly disrupt his plans. In a moment of desperation, he decided to directly challenge the Emperor himself. He ordered the void shields of his flagship to be disabled, inviting his father to him. However, at that very moment, the Emperor was engaged in another battle, a secret battle, right at the heart of the Imperial Palace. Beneath the Golden Throne lay the gates to the Elder Webway, a dimension between the real world and the warp. Due to Magnus's psychic message, cracks appeared in the walls of the Webway, through which armies of demons flooded in close proximity to the centre of humanity. Therefore, the Emperor, his loyal custodians, and some selected troops were engaged in a fierce battle in the Webway at the approaches to the gates under the Golden Throne. But even there, the Emperor felt Horus's call. The problem was that the gate could only be closed by someone possessing psychic power and seated on the Golden Throne, which only the Emperor himself was capable of. But the closest friend and advisor to the Lord of Humanity offered himself for the greatest sacrifice. He intended to take the Emperor's place on the throne, while the latter would be stopping Horus. The Emperor assembled a squad from the custodians, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, and some veterans from their legions, and teleported to the Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of the Sons of Horus, where the War Master awaited them. Horus, using the abilities bestowed upon him by the gods of chaos, scattered the Emperor's squad across the ship and set out across the decks in search of his father. However, the first he found was his closest friend and beloved brother, Sanguinius. Horus once again offered the Angel of Baal to join him, and upon hearing the refusal, launched an attack with bitterness in his heart. The battle of demigods was truly terrifying, and unfortunately Sanguinius, wounded after the fight with the demon of corn, lost to Horus, who was empowered by all four gods of chaos. In a final effort, the angel struck the War Master's armor, leaving a breach in it, after which Horus grabbed his throat and strangled his brother. It is said that thanks to the gift of foresight, Sanguinius saw the moment of his own death, and thus he was prepared to perish precisely at that time. In the moment of the Primarch's death, a wave of visions swept through his legion. Every Astartes of the Blood Angels felt the pain of their genetic father, and in each of them a bloody thirst boiled over. At the same moment, the entire legion left the walls of the palace and launched into a suicidal attack on the traitors. They literally bathed in the blood of their enemies. This became a complete surprise both for the heretics and for the loyalists. This attack gave time for the loyal forces to regroup and take cover, buying additional time for the Emperor. The final battle for the fate of all humanity was approaching, and every second was at stake. Caught in the suffocating grasp of Horus's claws, the body of the great angel ceased to resist. Only moments ago, the warrior had personally taken the life of the most beloved among brothers, and even through the defiling whisper of the chaos gods, he felt sorrow for the deed committed. It was in this moment that the Emperor found Horus. The Lord of Humanity was stunned. One of his sons was killed and lay at the feet of the second son, who had been the right hand of the Emperor but now had become nothing more than a vessel. The Emperor attempted to speak, but could only utter a quiet question, "Why?" Horus erupted in laughter like a madman. He claimed to know the truth about the creation of the Primarchs and about the source of the Emperor's power. He accused him of cowardice, since after that very deal with the Chaos gods, the Emperor did not try to subjugate more power, and he, Horus, was directly extracting power from the gods, already drawing himself closer to the Emperor in might. The Lord of Humanity shook his head in disappointment. It is not given to any mortal to subjugate the forces of chaos. Horus was merely a puppet of the warp, but he did not notice it. This statement struck the warrior. He lashed out at the father with a psychic lightning. Excruciating pain passed through the ruler of humanity, and he gathered all his strength to repel the son. A duel ensued. Father and son pelted each other with a hail of blows, while their minds struggled in a mental battle. Even though the Emperor was one of the most powerful beings ever to walk the galaxy, in this battle he was gradually losing. Deep in his heart, Horus still remained for the Emperor the first among the Primarchs, the most trusted commander of his army, and the beloved son. The warrior himself was at the peak of his power. His hatred for the father and support from all four Chaos gods, who with each passing minute infused their champion with more strength, hoping to finally rid themselves of their enemy, fueled him. At last, the Emperor felt the inevitability of defeat. Horus repelled all his psi attacks while inflicting terrible blows on the father himself. The slashed hand could no longer hold the sword. Broken ribs and a slit throat made it difficult to breathe. Lupercal grabbed the father and delivered a psychic blow directly to his face. Hair instantly burned off, one of the eyes leaked out, and the skin was scorched. The Emperor barely restrained himself from plunging into the abyss of pain, and for a moment he even felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was fear. Horus lifted the Emperor, tearing his arm from its socket, then broke his spine over his knee, and suddenly he stopped. The Emperor tried to survey his surroundings with his intact eye and saw a solitary figure entering the hall. Legends vary. The Imperial Fists assert it was one of their legion's terminators. Many others believe it was one of the custodians, but most likely the truth is that Horus was distracted by Olanius Pius, a guardsman of the Imperial army, but far from an ordinary guardsman. Olanius Pius was an Eternal, just as the Emperor and Vulcan. Moreover, he was older than the Emperor himself. In any case, no matter who exactly it was, only that this hero bravely rushed at Horus and instantly perished from just one glance of the arch-betrayer. The hero was reduced to nothing. In an instant he burned down to ashes, and his death struck the Emperor to his core. He had known this hero for many decades and deeply regretted such an inglorious end, and it was then he finally understood why he could not fight at full strength. Memories of Horus during the beginning of the Great Crusade prevented the Emperor from accepting the truth of what the warrior had become. At that moment, he abandoned any hope of reclaiming his son. Seizing the brief moment when Horus was distracted, the Emperor gathered his last strength, created a spear of potent warp energy in his hand, and hurled it at Horus, hitting the breach in the armor left by Sanguinius. Surprise at the sudden attack was immediately replaced by horror. The Lupercal realized that he could not stop this attack, even at the peak of his powers. The spear struck him, burning both his body and soul. The disappointed gods of chaos instantly abandoned him. The puppeteers discarded their toy, and then Horus realized what he had been doing all this time. In agony from the monstrous whirlwind created by the Emperor's strike, the warrior turned to his father. "I was a fool. How wrong I was. All is ruined. I have betrayed you, my father. I do not ask for leniency. Just end my torment. Kill me now. I'm too weak to resist them. They are calling to me. Please, end this." With those words, Horus was no more. His body and very soul didn't leave the slightest trace. He was simply erased from the universe. The Emperor collapsed on the floor, powerless. He clung to life solely through his strength of will. After Horus's death, a shockwave swept through the warp, carrying away all the demons from the battlefield. The other traitor Primarchs realized what was happening. However, they didn't know how to proceed. Very swiftly there was nothing left of Horus's forces. Without a single command, the heretics saw no reason to continue fighting, and began to retreat, simultaneously scattering into separate squads. Not only did each legion break away from the unified army, but they also split into individual warp bands after retreating. The loyal legions chased the traitors as far as their strength allowed. The Chaos followers in turn sought refuge in the Eye of Terror, the greatest warp storm in the galaxy. At this time, Rogel found the Emperor's nearly breathless body. Primarch Dawn was horrified. He could have never imagined that the master of mankind could be so gravely injured in battle. It was then that the barely alive Emperor whispered to his son a request to deliver him to the Golden Throne as soon as possible. The surviving loyalists teleported from the vengeful spirit to Terra's throne room, executing their lord's will. There, Jagatai Khan, still elated from victory, and Malsador the Sigillite, who was exerting his last strength to keep the webway gate sealed, awaited them. Khan cheerfully greeted Dawn, but seeing the Emperor's nearly breathless body and the absence of Sanguinius, his mood darkened instantly. He swiftly lifted the father and helped Dawn carry him to the throne. By the time they reached it and relayed the Emperor's directives, with the waiting Mechanicum by their side, Sigillite was near death. His life was sustained solely by his willpower and his desire not to let down his closest friend and lord. Malsador's desiccated body was detached from the throne, instantly crumbling to dust. The Emperor was placed in his stead, connected to the throne, and several life-supporting systems were reconfigured for the sustaining of the Lord. With his friend's death and the connection to the Golden Throne made, the Emperor momentarily awoke from oblivion. Poor and brave Malkador the hero. He preserved a fraction of his strength for me, gave me a little time to communicate my final will to you. If you fulfill it to the letter, I shall not die entirely. At least my spirit will survive. My wounds are dreadful, heavier than I had hoped, but lighter than I feared. Psychic powers will return to me over time, but my body shall never heal. Nevermore shall I walk among you. Now I am shackled to this machine till the end of time. My loyal bodyguards and counselors know what must be done. Fulfill all their requests. Dawn and Jagatai, much labor awaits you still. Though the serpent's head is crushed, its body's coils might yet strangle humanity. You and your faithful brothers are duty-bound to continue the fight. Cleanse our stars from the filth of betrayal. Never again must we allow chaos such a chance. Now depart, all of you. You know my commands. Execute them honorably. Many nightmares yet await us in the universe, and our battle does not end today. From now on begins our crusade to save mankind. Be faithful, be strong, be vigilant." After these words, the Emperor fell silent forever. His body was connected to additional life support machines, but they were marginally effective. The Emperor's body decayed very slowly yet surely, while his mind was stuck between the Immaterium and his crippled corpse. After the end of the Heresy, the Emperor, with the remnants of his will, supports the Astronomicon beacon and keeps the webway gates sealed. Sometimes he appears to great heroes as a vision, and to the truly chosen he grants a brief mental conversation. In the next 10,000 years, the Emperor will still, to the best of his abilities, protect humanity and eternally fight the horrors of chaos in the warp. What of the rest of the Imperium? Some Primarchs, such as Leman Russ and Jagatai Khan, will pursue the traitors to avenge the Emperor's effective demise. The Dark Angels learned immediately after the Heresy about the schism within their own legion, which led them to destroy their homeworld. Those traitors who were not killed or captured fled to the Eye of Terror, and have since been known as the Fallen Angels. The Primarch of the Ultramarines, Rabut Gilliman, will write his most famous work, which significantly influences the development of the Imperium. His Codex Astartes, a set of rules for the Space Marines, mandated splitting all loyal legions into separate orders, 1,000 Astartes each, because if one order turns traitor in the future, this threat could be contained. If a whole legion turns, then great wars would once again be inevitable. These changes were not immediately accepted by everyone, but in the end, only the Space Wolves remained the sole legion that absolutely does not adhere to the Codex. Gradually, the Primarchs left their legions. Some went on campaigns and never returned. Some were mortally wounded and slept in stasis, such as Rabut Gilliman himself. The Primarch era was passing, and the Imperium was also restructuring. It was governed by the Council of Terror, assembled by the Emperor himself. Gradually among the people the cult of the God Emperor emerged, which eventually gained incredible popularity and influence, and is now the main and only religion in the Imperium. By the 40th millennium, the Imperium will experience several major conflicts, encounter new enemies, and transform into a cruel, bureaucratic, corrupt and religious machine, where human lives are worth nothing. All people are just necessary cogs in the unwieldy construct known as the Imperium of Man. What Alfarius Omegon, and later Horus, warned about, came to pass. The Imperium overcame chaos in only one battle, but now it is slowly decaying in its own vice, and in the long-term perspective of war, it clearly cannot stand forever. What the Emperor himself feared also happened. In the eyes of people who for hundreds of generations have not seen him alive, he has become a god, nothing less.